This video contains discussions of depression, anxiety, isolation, self-harm, suicide, and suicide ideation. There are also some recordings of a video game developer using homophobic slurs. If you're not comfortable with one or any of these topics, I recommend that you stop watching now. Your health should always come first. Because of the sensitivity of these topics, this video will most likely get demonetized by YouTube. So if you would like to support me and my work on this channel, I'd highly appreciate it if you visited my Patreon page. You'll find the link in the description. What comes to mind when you think about Japanese horror? Maybe it's pale human-like ghosts with long black hair, cursed houses, or failed rituals with dire consequences. What about American horror? Probably masked serial killers with an affinity for killing teens, right? Italian horror? Hell, even if you haven't heard the word giallo before, you probably know exactly what it looks like if you've seen anything made by Mario Bava or Dario Argento. These characteristics are obviously not wholly representative of the vast amount of different horror stories that are offered by these different parts of the world. What I'm trying to say is that there are both cultural differences and similarities between how various countries create horror fiction that are fairly easy to spot and compare. But what about Swedish horror? What makes something a typical Swedish horror story? I've lived in this country my whole life, and even I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question. Swedish horror stories absolutely exist. It's not a particularly rich tradition though, especially not in the past 20 years or so, where most of our films and TV programming have consisted of subpar comedies, cop shows, and people being uncomfortable at dinner tables.
Det är klart att det inte bara kan skita med regnvissen.
So you can imagine that finding proper Swedish horror games is an even harder task. There are clear examples of horror games that were made in Sweden. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is the most well known, though it doesn't take place in Sweden. It doesn't have any Swedish characters, it doesn't talk about any specifically Swedish issues, and the story is loosely based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, an American author. You could argue that the lack of a combat system is the big differentiator, although that's more of a trend that the developers at fictional games helped to popularize, rather than a cultural staple. Sure, we do have very strict gun laws, but Swedes aren't exactly known for their pacifism. I mean, some of our biggest exports are the Battlefield games. And actual weapons. Yearwalk by Simogo Games takes its inspiration from a 200-year-old Swedish tradition called årsgång, where people went out on nightly strolls during wintertime in an attempt to gain premonitions of the coming year. It's not a bad concept to base a horror game around, but it's such an old and outdated tradition that a lot of Swedes will likely learn about it for the first time as they're playing Yearwalk. That was the case for me anyway. As far as I can tell, there really are no horror games out there that are as undeniably Swedish from a contemporary perspective as the mod-turned standalone game, Cry of Fear. Part 1. Stockholm i mitt hjärta. If I'm gonna talk about how this game relates to the Swedish experience, I also have to talk about my own experience of being Swedish. I was born in 1994, too late to fully experience the 90s, but also early enough to have some memories from the time. When Half-Life and later Counter-Strike was released, I was way too young to play either of them, and my parents had a mostly uncompromising view on age recommendations on video games. The cultural impact those games had during the following years was hard to miss though. Counter-Strike, itself a mod of Half-Life, was especially prevalent at Swedish LAN parties. Even close to 10 years after the original release, me and a couple of friends still played it, and the follow-up Counter-Strike Source at these types of parties. The series was so ingrained in Swedish video game culture that for a long time I was convinced that Valve, who still publishes the series, was a Swedish studio, or at least a European one. It was perhaps no surprise then that the Half-Life modding scene that birthed Counter-Strike would have passionate members in Sweden as well. The Cry of Fear mod was released long after Half-Life, So long that Valve themselves were able to release Half-Life 2 and 2 follow-up episodes in the meantime. Yet it was built with the same engine as the original game, an engine called Gold Source. Cryofear looks slightly more modern than Half-Life, but the quirks of the engine are easily noticeable in both. Today, you'd assume that most video games contain some basic level of physics. The Gold Source engine, however, doesn't. All the animations are handmade by the developers, and at times it shows. You inexplicably get stuck on corners, resulting in everything from small inconveniences to premature deaths. Okay, let's try that again. And of course, there's the dreaded crouch jumping mechanic, a maneuver where you awkwardly crouch and jump at the same time in order to get through tight openings, which can also result in premature deaths if timed incorrectly. Those things are not what makes the choice of engine interesting though. Rather, it's what I guess you could call a mindset that working with Gold Source clearly brought with it. If it's the same engine that made Counter-Strike, a game about terrorists and counter-terrorists shooting at each other with a variety of loud-as-hell weapons, of course Cryofear was gonna have some of those same type of weapons as well. It would almost have been a waste to use this specific engine and not have some high-power shooty bang-bang in the game. That the main character Simon carries everything from pistols and shotguns to bolt-action sniper rifles, and keeps finding ammo clips for these guns sprinkled all over central Stockholm, is completely ridiculous. When I said that the gun laws in Sweden are strict, I mean that you're not even allowed to own tear gas unless you've got permission from the Swedish police. I honestly don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that a lot of Swedes probably haven't even seen a gun in real life. At least not one being used. And yet, the inclusion of these firearms in Cryofear totally works. There is a narrative justification that we will get to later, but it also works because Gold Source games about shooting soldiers and monsters were, at least for a time, as essential to Swedish video gaming as kebab pizza is to hungover people on New Year's Day. Despite the lack of realism, it ironically makes Cryofear feel more Swedish. The most obvious connection to Sweden is the game's environments. This is no "it's supposed to be Stockholm but we shot it in Vancouver" type of deal. The developers really went out of their way to make it look and feel as much as the actual Swedish capital city as possible. Among the developers' commentary tracks, which you unlock after beating the game, or by simply opening the right folder in the file explorer, designer and composer Andreas Rönnberg talks about how he went all around town to capture footage and record sounds from local landmarks, as well as places that were significant to him personally. There's the suburb where Andreas lived at the time, the apartment building where his dad lived, and the upper secondary school he attended as a teenager, called Cybergymnasiet. Even the characters borrow their faces from Andreas' family members, like his brother and his sister's fiancé. And like Sam Lake, creative director at Remedy gave his own face to the character of Max Payne, Andreas gave his to Simon. For someone who's never been to Sweden, this is probably just a neat little tidbit. Especially if you live in a place like New York or Tokyo, seeing virtual recreations of your neighborhood might be so common that it barely elicits a reaction in you. However, the streets that you see in Cryofear, the buildings, and even the look of the more personal places from Andreas' life are rarely ever depicted this way. Sure, I can visit the Swedish countryside with the old-fashioned Falu red houses with white corners in games like Unraveled or Generation Zero. But unless someone else makes a non-profit mod that gets away with depicting real-life companies without permission, no other game will ever put me in a digital space where I can stand face to face with the sign outside the Swedish employment office. The amount of times I've had to go to this place is a bit more than I want to think about. After I graduated, the lack of job security killed my dream of becoming a journalist, and my first visit to Arbetsförmedlingen, as it's called in Swedish, marked the start of several years of financial and emotional struggles. When I didn't get any jobs, it made me want to search for new ones even less, and caused the people at the social insurance agency to lower my monthly allowance, which was pretty low to begin with. When I did get jobs, they were either of the soul-sucking kind with low pay, or the good kind that didn't last very long. I also had to attend a seemingly endless amount of lectures from job coaches that were supposed to teach us everything from where to find jobs to how to perform during job interviews. Eventually, I had been taught by so many of these job coaches that I was asked to stand in front of my class and explain how to make a visually appealing resume. And isn't that fucking ironic? Just looking at the sign, even in a video game, makes me feel helpless. I genuinely fear having to go back there ever again. So, I guess it's fitting then, that it's here, in a horror game. I did not grow up in Stockholm, but I've walked these streets, and others like them, for my entire life. I've seen so many buildings with variations of these white, beige, yellow and pink colors. Older red brick buildings, newer buildings overlapping with architecture spanning hundreds of years back. Cobblestone paths leading to slightly uneven and narrow cobblestone stairs with black metal railings, followed by modern plain office and shopping districts. I think my parents used to own a red car almost exactly like this one in the early 90s. I've gone to several house parties at buildings like the one where Andreas' dad lived, with these spiraling staircases that I swear to God will be the death of me someday. I've gone to several schools with this same kind of dull yet wide and inviting look. And this suburb, with the mix of colorful wood and white brick houses, is not too dissimilar to the one I lived in during the majority of my childhood. This kitchen is almost a one-to-one replica of the kitchen in my childhood home. The look of the stove, the color and pattern on the cabinets, the spice rack. It's uncanny how accurate it all is. Although we didn't usually cook shirts for dinner. Not red ones anyway. Not to mention all the times I've traveled by Stockholm's subway system, both by the new and sleeker and the older blue trains depicted in Cry of Fear. While the engine severely limited the scale of the city, since it wasn't originally built for large outdoor environments, the developers nailed pretty much everything else. It's honestly haunting to witness the kind of violence that is depicted in Cry of Fear in the context of these specific environments. This scene in particular, with the blood splattered over the side of a very ordinary Swedish house, was the most hard-hitting of all for me. Simon is standing still in this footage because I wanted a good camera angle, but also because I just couldn't stop looking at it. The image is just so surreal. The blood and gore is so far removed from anything I've ever experienced in real life, perhaps most of all because I didn't grow up in an area of town that was continuously and undeservedly harassed by the police. The setting, however, is so close that I could probably take a walk from where I currently live and find a house almost exactly like this one in 10 minutes or less. We can enjoy horror partly because it allows us a measure of distance from what scares us. Mentally, physically, and yes, geographically. Zombies are scary, but you can easily remove yourself from encounters with them, in films or video games, since they're obviously not real. Likewise, there can be a small sense of otherworldliness when watching or playing something that takes place in a different culture than your own. The shorter the distance to your own life and your personal experiences, the more uncomfortable the horror becomes. Before playing Cry of Fear, I had never experienced this short a distance while playing a horror game. That I had to shoot some Silent Hill looking monsters who look way goofier in broad daylight didn't change that one bit. Visiting and revisiting some of these places in real life made me not only appreciate the effort that was put into making the game, it made me appreciate the actual places in a new way. I'm not proud to be a Swede. I'm lucky to be in some regards. We don't have the worst healthcare system in the world, for one. But I find it hard to be excited about a citizenship I had no choice but to be born into. Still, I can't deny that there is something special about seeing locations with such personal meaning to me and the developers of Cry of Fear being eternalized in such a detailed way, knowing that they will be seen by perhaps hundreds of thousands of people all around the globe. You might not have the same personal connection to this city as I have, but getting a glimpse of it might spark an interest in it the same way a game like Detention sparked an interest in me to learn more about the history and culture of Taiwan. I'm a big fan of video games as a means of broadening one's knowledge about the world, about people. And personally, I believe that Cry of Fear manages to do both in a very honest way. So honest, in fact, that it slowly goes from being a neat recreation of some recognizable landmarks to a highly unflattering depiction of the Swedish condition, specifically among men. What, did you think the game is Swedish simply because of its authentic crosswalk lights? No. We have merely scratched the surface at this point. Pimthony Online Tano here, the internet's cutest horror nerd. And it's time for a review of Swedish angst! In 2012, around the time of Cry of Fear's original release, BRIS, or Children's Rights and Society as they would be called in English, released a report about the mental health of Swedish kids. It's not specifically referenced in the game, but a newspaper issue scattered around some of the game's environments mentions BRIS in a headline that is similarly alarming as the contents of the real-life report. It contains an extensive analysis of 1,530 anonymous cases between May 2010 and May 2011, wherein children of the average age of 15 reached out to BRIS about their various personal problems. It attempted to bring to light that without building trust with children, properly listening to them, and taking their issues seriously, they will not want to seek professional help, or even open up about their issues at all. Approximately 95% of the children who took part in the study were girls, meaning that only 5% were boys. That kind of begs the question, where do the boys and men who keep silent eventually end up? Where do you go with all your feelings of sadness, of not fitting in, or not even wanting to be alive, when you have no trust in the people whose job it is to help you deal with those feelings? Who do you become? This is the basis for the character of Simon. Part 2. Who is Simon? And why is he wrong? Let's start off by looking at how he introduces himself.
I've always felt alone. My whole life. For as long as I can remember. I don't know if I like it, or if I'm just used to it. But I do know this. Being lonely does things to you. Feeling shit, bitter and angry all the time just eats away at you.
Simon serves as a generic archetype of the isolated loner. He is almost completely defined by his depression, his anxiety, and lack of social skills. He's basically one black beanie away from looking like the poster boy for a popular internet meme / modern take on Malthusian ideology called the Doomer, a representation of the idea that making human connections and striving towards making the world a better place is meaningless, because of the supposed inevitability of societal collapse and extinction. Simon isn't particularly open about his ideological alignments though. In fact, by the time the end credits starts rolling, we still know very little about his past. All we know for certain is this. After having spent years feeling and being alone, Simon became friends with a girl at school named Sophie. At some point, he decided to profess his love for her, which turned out to not be mutual.
Simon, let me go.
I love you, Sophie.
I have to leave. Please.
I fucking love you.
Just let me go, Simon.
Sometime later, a car crash left Simon paralyzed from the waist down. He then went even deeper into his depression, slowly losing his will to live. Simon's counselor, Dr. Purnell, suggested that he should write a book. The book in which the majority of Cry of Fear takes place. The guns, the ammo lying around all over town, the monsters, the occasional mind-bending nightmare sequences are all born out of Simon's imagination. His projections of the feelings he has about himself and the few people that are close to him. If you've played any psychological horror game released after the year 2001, you've probably come across a plot similar to this one at least once before. However, that doesn't make Cry of Fear entirely derivative. Whether it was the developer's intention or not, Simon's story is, perhaps, more universally relatable because of the generic and archetypical nature of the main character. Anyone who's ever reached their emotional rock bottom can find some aspect of Simon's situation that rings familiar, me included. That can be a good thing, but it can also be dangerous if handled carelessly. This is going to require us to dive into the area of psychology, an area outside of my professional expertise, so I decided to ask a fellow YouTube essayist for some assistance.
I'm Courtney Garcia. I'm the writer for Screen Therapy. I make video essays about positive media psychology and how we use games, movies, and other forms of media, how we can use them mindfully for self-growth and self-betterment. Something about Simon that is particularly interesting is that he's not a movie character, he is a video game character, and that completely changes our experience of him. We don't just see his actions and see him express his thoughts. You as the player actually have to step into his shoes and perform these actions and kind of meld your own identity with him. That's typically what we do with video game characters. It's called identification, and it's a lot stronger than what happens between us and a movie character. Every time you play as a video game character, you make a transition from calling them him or Simon into calling him I. And that transition can be really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable or even dangerous for a character like Simon. Because the closer you come to thinking of him as I, the more you identify and rationalize his actions, justify them. And the thing about Simon is that he's written to be on the precipice of doing some really terrible things. All the responsibility is on the player to pull themselves out of being I with Simon, out of being Simon, and to remember who they are, and to not try to rationalize or justify his actions the way Simon convinces himself, and in a way kind of tries to convince the player what he was doing was the only course of action.
Those terrible things that Simon might do are determined by two player choices. The first one is made when you meet Sophie on a rooftop. She doesn't seem to know anything about the monsters running around down below, and is barely fazed by Simon's distress. Even here, in the fictional world that Simon built inside his book, Sophie rejects his romantic feelings. The scene then ends with Sophie taking her own life, followed by the appearance of one of the game's bosses, who hovers in the air while being strapped to a chair. A fairly obvious representation of how Simon views himself, now that he is in a wheelchair. The first time you're playing Cry of Fear, you might not even realize that there is a choice to be made here. You can either fight the boss head on, or you can actually just leave the rooftop and never look back. If you're playing on one of the game's harder difficulty levels, skipping a whole boss fight will probably sound pretty damn good considering all the ammunition and health items you get to save for later. You have no reason to believe that this is one of the few instances where the game will judge you, so why not choose the safer path? Well, if you do, the game will end with Simon committing suicide. The second choice appears at the abandoned mental hospital. Here, you run into the doctor, who in retrospect is obviously just Dr. Purnell wearing a gas mask. In exchange for the key you need to progress, the doctor wants you to get him a gun. Here, the options are presented to you visually. Either you do, or you don't. The choice is supposed to determine if the real Simon can put his trust in Dr. Purnell. But unlike the real Purnell, this one has given Simon and the player zero reasons to trust him up until this point. In one scene, the doctor has tied a seemingly normal human being to a cross and proceeds to remove his head with a saw. When he realizes that Simon is watching, he locks him in the room and leaves him there to fight the game's second boss fight. If you do decide to give him the gun, he uses it to shoot Simon in the shoulder, permanently reducing your life bar. Frankly, I'm not sure what the intended message is supposed to be here. On a surface level, it tells the player that trust is for suckers, that it will only be rewarded with pain. But I guess that it could also reflect how Simon wants to seek help, despite fearing the emotional vulnerability, how it might hurt before it gets better. Either way, you'll be able to progress. And either way, you'll have to fight the doctor and, finally, kill him. Why on earth then would you give this man a gun if all it does is make the rest of the game harder? Well, if you don't, the game will once again end with Simon committing suicide. It doesn't matter if you beat the previous boss. If you don't make the right choice both times, Simon dies. Which means that 3 out of the 4 main endings are practically the same. The only thing that does change between the 3 is what Simon writes in his suicide note. That and whose life or lives he will take before he takes his own. Maybe the intention was for the player to put in a little more effort to achieve the game's best ending, but even that one has a pretty huge asterisk attached to it. If you fight the boss on the rooftop and give the gun to the doctor, during the game's final moments, the perspective will shift from book Simon to the real Simon, as he's writing his book. The final showdown is, fittingly, against a twisted version of himself. At least, that's what you and Simon sees. In actuality, he's mowing down 2 police officers who came to check on him, for unclear reasons. He then spends the rest of his life in a mental hospital. And while he's regretful about killing the officers, he finally feels at peace with himself. I'll try not to repeat myself too much, because some of the issues with these narrative conclusions are reminiscent of another video game I've covered called The Suicide of Rachel Foster. I guess you could see this video as a companion piece of sorts. In that video, I was mostly negative towards the game's handling of trauma, and rightfully so. Cry of Fear, in comparison, is at least attempting to reach a noble goal. Through the choices you make as the player, you take part in Simon's process of learning to trust, to build connections with people, to forgive them, and ultimately, forgive himself. Defeating the boss on the rooftop, for example, can be read as Simon accepting Sophie's friendship and his dependence on his wheelchair. That this choice, along with giving the gun to the doctor, helps Simon to recover from his trauma works well from a narrative standpoint, and it sends a healthy message to the player about reaching out for help and trusting the people who want to help. But the choices only really work if you already know what they represent, and during your first playthrough, you probably don't, which makes it a high risk that the first ending you will see is one where Simon gives up and claims that living the rest of your life in a wheelchair isn't worth it, that there is nothing worth living for. This is why the identification process that Courtney mentioned, where the player transitions from calling the main character him or her or them to I, is so worrying in this case, since it's so easy for almost anyone to connect to Simon early on. It's equally easy to be convinced by his reasoning by the end. But Simon is wrong. Being dependent on a wheelchair doesn't make your life worthless, and there is always something to live for, whether it's a friend, a hobby, or an important cause or goal. While viewing people in need of wheelchairs as in any way lesser than other people is pretty damn ableist, I think it's important to understand why Simon would think this way. In any of the bad endings, Simon hates literally everything about himself. He has dug a hole so deep that the only thing he sees is his own dark reflection. Sure, it was the developer's choice to include this ableist remark, which they absolutely did not have to do. But this is what I mean by the game being honest in an unflattering way. It reveals the problematic aspects of not just Simon's worldview, but the developers, and to an extent, maybe even Swedish society as a whole. We do seem to view people with physical and mental disabilities as lesser. We forget about them. We forget to adapt our schools and workplaces to their specific needs, and we don't do proper research or even report on the various crimes they fall victim to. The problem is that there's no one in the game who's there to tell Simon, or tell you, that he's wrong. All responsibility to detach from Simon, after having spent so much time connecting to him, falls on the player. Now, when I say that players might have a hard time doing this all on their own, I'm not saying that they aren't able to see the difference between fiction and reality. What I am saying is that one can easily become so invested in a character that distinguishing between their good and bad actions and opinions might be difficult. I mean, how many times have you read or heard that someone thought Walter White from Breaking Bad was the hero of the story? How many times have you seen people hate on The Last of Us Part 2 because they couldn't detach themselves from protagonists Ellie and Joel to see things from Abby's perspective? It's also worth pointing out that the best ending is not necessarily good either. On one hand, it makes the story of Cry of Fear a decent cautionary tale about how not seeking help can sometimes result in horrible consequences. On the other hand, it tells the player that Simon's path would have led to blood and death no matter what. The only difference being who the blood belongs to. Actually, there is a fifth, and on a surface level, better ending that can be achieved in the game's co-op campaign, where the car accident that caused Simon's injuries and his trauma is successfully stopped, and where Simon and Sophie appear to have entered a romantic relationship. This may be intended to be non-canonical, but it sure says something about the overarching narrative of the game. The only way that Simon could have avoided harming someone, or himself, the only way that Sophie could have loved him romantically, was if he had never gotten hit by that car. Courtney taught me something from narrative psychology called contamination narratives and redemption narratives. These terms represent how we write and look back on our life stories. Take my story of having dealt with the Swedish employment office, for example. Those years marked the start of my adult life, and everything I thought would come easy for me, getting a job, earning money, being able to afford all the things I both needed and wanted all on my own, proved to be crushingly difficult for me. As a result, I wrote myself a contaminated narrative, where the reason I couldn't achieve those things were all my fault, and that I was never going to be a proper adult. That I was, in a way, tainted and unable to change. But my story didn't end there. I moved to another city, I started studying at university. I got out of my emotional rut. I made efforts to turn my contaminated narrative into a redemptive one. Simon's narrative is contaminated, but he never gets a proper chance to change that, which is only worsened by the implications of the co-op ending.
While it's a great feel-good ending in a traditional sense, it's not extremely helpful for people who are playing this who have related to Simon, because the message is, as soon as you are contaminated, that is it. The only way to solve it is to go back in time. If you are following a redemption narrative, the best ending for Simon would be to allow him to have gotten in that accident, allow him to have experienced depression, anxiety, and isolation. Those things aren't inherently contaminating. They don't necessarily change the course of your life forever. You can acquire a physical disability and still lead a fulfilling and rich life. And so I think the best conclusion for Simon would have been a life in which he could have had the trust and social support to get through his mental illnesses. He doesn't need to have a romantic partner. He can develop a sense of comfort from himself, within himself, and he can still find a way to lead a fulfilling life, even with a new disability. However, it's a tall ask, and I don't think it was something that the writers had in mind, because everything else in the story was informed by a sense of contamination.
Part 3. The Edginess. Classic survival horror titles from the 1990s used to start with a foreboding, albeit unhelpfully non-specific content warning, letting the player know that the game contains some explicit violence and gore. Content warnings in video games have luckily started to improve in recent years, but the developers of Cry of Fear decided to go old school, and then some. The content warning for Cry of Fear reads, "This game contains violence and gore, and can cause fear, depression, heart failure, and suicide. Users and viewers' discretion is advised." This is written in front of a character model sitting in a chair who appears to have shot themselves with a shotgun. This is the first thing the player sees when booting up the game, and already the topic of suicide is being sensationalized. It's not the only time either. In the train, there is an ad that reads "Självmord, mörda dig själv som fan", which directly translates to "suicide, murder yourself like hell". This is clearly meant to be a joke, since the developers included an ad right next to it asking you to adopt a World of Warcraft nerd. This underlying sense of edginess, of sensitive subjects being treated mockingly in order to evoke strong feelings in the player, severely undermines the aspects of the game that the developers presumably want the player to take seriously. For example, there is a short subplot about a child murderer that is just kind of there. It's just a deeply unsettling detour that leads absolutely nowhere. Why is it here? Well, because it's unsettling, of course. No other reason required. There are a few enemies in the game that will purposefully end their own lives when they get close to Simon, or when he has dealt enough damage to them. One enemy can even force Simon to shoot himself if the player fails a short quicktime event. When healing himself with morphine shots, Simon reveals old self-inflicted scars across his wrist. At first, I personally had a hard time determining if these were cases of deliberate sensationalism or genuine attempts to serve the story. The monsters are, as previously stated, a reflection of Simon's inner thoughts. They're trying to provoke Simon into committing this horrible act, because that's what the real Simon is trying to convince himself of doing. From a narrative standpoint, it works. In the context of a game that is telling the player to murder themselves like hell, as a joke, it doesn't. You can't put the introspective tone of Silent Hill 2 and the edgy nihilism of Postal 2 into a blender and expect the result to be anything but the video game equivalent of a piece of cake covered in ketchup. That's right, I put 2 food analogies into a single sentence because that's just how good of a video game critic I am! I can see some potential defenses for these decisions. Maybe the developers were just bad at English. Maybe they meant to make the content warning useful. As for the train ad, maybe it was meant as an innocent Easter egg for the comparatively few players who could actually read it. As a Swede myself, I have to say no, young Swedes are not that bad at English. According to Education First, Sweden has consistently been on or close to the very top of the list of international English speakers for the last 10 years, as far as I can tell. Even if that wasn't the case, one of the developers of Cry of Fear was a native English speaker, meaning that this wording was 100% intentional. Holy yikesarinos, Leatherpatch! No, really, that's what Batman used to be called in Sweden, look it up. And the train ad? Yeah, sure. A lot of you would probably never realize what it said if I hadn't told you. But I'm here to look at how Cry of Fear relates to Sweden, the Swedish experience, and the people living it. And this ad says just as much about the people who created Simon as it does about the character. The edginess of Cry of Fear isn't there to commentate on Simon's condition. It's there because, at least at the time, the developers seemed to be pretty edgy themselves. Andreas Rönnberg, who called himself the leader Cry of Fear, used to post videos on the dev team's YouTube channel where he, for example, throws around homophobic slurs.
We are a fag. Fucking
fag. Fucking fags. There's a fag there. Come here, fag. It's a bit gay that the whole station is dark, so what the fuck.
He also shows off his soft air guns and uses them indoors for some reason, not to mention the name of the dev team, which Andreas presumably picked. Team Psykskallar, or Team Psycho Heads. It's harder to seriously engage with any attempts at talking about mental health in a respectable way when the people who are doing the talking name themselves after a word that is used to demean people with mental illnesses. I don't know Andreas or any of the other team members personally. I have no idea what any of them are like in person, especially since almost 10 years have passed since the game was under development. The point is not to call out Team Psykskallar as bad people. The point I'm trying to make is that when I watch these videos and compare them to Cry of Fear, the game seems to come more, way more, from a personal place, rather than an informed one, even if it's never said out loud. I still believe that this game attempts to say something important about mental health, about putting trust in other people and accepting yourself and your past experiences. However, the main focus seems to have been to make an aggressively violent and nasty survival horror game, where the topic of depression and suicide ideation is used in service of the horror, and not the other way around. The edginess is offensive, no doubt. But for the developers, it might also have been subconsciously defensive. If you've never talked to anyone about how to properly deal with your mental health problems, either with friends or medical professionals, if you've been raised into thinking that emotions should be dealt with aggressively or in complete isolation, you'd probably be scared to talk about them in an open and sincere way.
If we're really working with the idea that the writers might have been, struggling with some feelings of contamination in terms of Simon's journey, that he was contaminated, and with how they wrote him as this kind of lone wolf character where he's isolated and unable to express himself in emotionally healthy ways, it kind of all makes sense. It kind of stays in character for the game entirely, because when you can't express yourself in an emotionally healthy way, your emotions come out in shocking ways. Because if you're not allowed to say these things quietly, you might want to scream these things, you might want to yell these things. You can't ask for people's attention, but sometimes you can demand it by shocking them, and it serves its own little purpose that you're being seen, but you didn't have to ask for it in a way that felt weak. There's a kind of sense of strength when you can shove it in people's faces and be shocking or sensationalized about it. You take ownership over it, and nobody could say that you're weak if you were to treat the topic of suicide like this, even if you actually struggle with suicide ideation personally. It might be just a sense of needing to maintain that power dynamic, of maintaining a sense of strength and control when starting these conversations, instead of being, emotionally yielding or being softer, which is seen as weaker.
There can be a therapeutic use for edgier content like this. There's obviously the power fantasy aspect. Violent video games in particular often tell the player that they are special, that they have the strength and stamina to face everything in their way, and that they are in complete control over themselves and the space they inhabit. Games which depict sensitive and difficult subjects can absolutely cause real-life harm, in the form of anxiety and panic attacks, to players who've had first-hand experiences with these subjects. There is also the issue of so-called suicide contagion, being exposed to detailed media reporting about specific suicides, knowing or knowing of someone who's committed suicide, or even watching a fictional character go through with it, has been shown to have a potentially contagious effect, which is why clear and comprehensive content and trigger warnings are so bloody important. However, for some, playable scenes reminiscent of past trauma can have the completely opposite effect. Cry of Fear, for example, gives players a physically safe way of facing and dealing with their bad experiences head-on. In that sense, I think Cry of Fear can be a genuinely useful tool. It's just that you're exposed to a pretty problematic worldview in the process. That's a little better, don't you think? The most Swedish thing about Cry of Fear is not its connection to Half-Life or Counter-Strike, or its detailed recreation of the capital. The most Swedish thing of all is its main character, Simon. Simon represents our well-being, or lack thereof. He represents our unattended bitterness and sadness, and our misguided solutions to our problems. Most of all, though, he represents a disheartening trend among Swedish men. For the past 20 years, the leading cause of death among Swedish men between the ages of 15 and 44 has been suicide. Those who don't take their lives might instead turn to the incel community, considering that Sweden seems to have the highest number of incels in the world based on population size, according to a study by FOI. Incel, or involuntary celibate, is on its own a fairly neutral term. Sure, it might suck that you're not having sex if that's something you're very much into having, but it's by no means a character flaw. It's the community and culture built around it that has turned it into something quite horrifying and vile. The purpose of most, if not all incel groups is not to create a safe space for what is mostly men to come together and support each other, but to degrade yourself and how you look while collectively blaming the women who don't want to sleep with you. Simon might not be an incel, it's not directly addressed in the game anyway, but the reason why one becomes an incel, or why one chooses to retreat to a life of emotional isolation, is largely the same. If someone wrongly tells you, or if you tell yourself, that searching for help is meaningless, or if you simply can't due to economic reasons, what's left, apart from taking revenge on the people you think are to blame for your misery, or giving up on your life entirely? I want to make this perfectly clear. I like Cry of Fear. I think it ultimately does a great job of portraying a serious problem that this country is still struggling with to this day, even if that wasn't the developer's main focus. I don't like how the game digs an emotional black hole and revels in it, rather than trying to climb out of it, and properly communicate to the audience that trauma doesn't have to taint you for the rest of your life. It can be so hard to reach out to someone, friend or medical professional, but it beats the alternative every single time. Not only is it the best thing to do, but the bravest, to dare to be taken care of by somebody else. Hell, even if you feel like you don't have any kind of mental illness, it can still be extremely valuable to get your emotional health checked by a professional once in a while, if you're able. Our minds are just as much a part of us as our bodies, after all. Wherever you live in the world, you should always try to find help, if you need it. If you can't afford a therapist, or if the waiting line is too long, turn to someone close to you that you feel that you can rely on. You don't dare to talk with anybody you know? Search for internet forums or hotlines that deal with your specific problems. Always keep looking for positive solutions. Solutions that don't involve harming yourself. Because one will eventually work for you. The reason why I relate Simon to my own personal experience as a Swede is because I've personally experienced several sides of his struggles. I wrote myself a contaminated narrative. I met with psychologists who were both very helpful and who didn't take me seriously at all. I've been the bitter person who felt deserving of more, and I've been the person who've managed to turn things around and find joy in life again. I kid you not, wrote a short horror film as a high school project with a plot that's not too dissimilar to the plot of Cry of Fear. And I don't think I'd even heard of the game back then. The true horror of Cry of Fear, for me, is how easy it is to imagine a different version of myself who only made slightly different choices in life, who ended up almost exactly like Simon. And even though a lot of people around the world probably feel the same way about him, I think that he might speak to us Swedes more than most. Maybe I haven't been very good at describing exactly why. Or maybe it's like the words of Joakim Berg in the Kent song Det finns inga ord. And in our country, you must not stick out. This is Sweden. Please cry when no one sees. There are no words for it in this fucking language. I have no words for how we breathe, think, and feel the same. Thank you so much for watching. And a special thanks to the amazing people who support me with $5 or more on Patreon. They are Nichtschwert, Rocky Dennis, Tobias Mattsson, Håvard Krugerud, Professor Flowers, Vinders, Philip Kirschner, Eli Berg-Moss, Rob Robbins, Seth Zard, Ron Megaron of Megaron TV, JK, and Starlit Mansion. I want to thank Courtney Garcia from Screen Therapy for taking the time to talk to me, and help me make the video way better than if I had made it all on my own. I also want to thank Kiki from Transparency, Eurothug4000, and Matt Cox for proofreading and editing the script. You'll find all of their links in the description. Matt does editing professionally, so I highly recommend their services if you yourself do any type of creative writing. Oh, and if you like the cool looking Silent Hill 3 shirt I was wearing in this video, I mean, why wouldn't you? It was actually made by one of my patrons, JK, and you can buy one yourself right now from their Redbubble page. You'll find a link in the description for that as well. So apparently Team Psykskalla are currently working on a remake of Cry of Fear, which, I mean, that could be nice. I mean, the Gold Source engine obviously has its kind of bad quirks, so on a technical level I think they can make something really cool, but I also hope they take the opportunity to fix some of the more problematic aspects of the story. So if you're watching this, anyone from Team Psykskalla, I hope you might take some suggestions.
Ja men du, nu ska det bli gott med marängsviss va? Ja?